kind of apology is that? It's not an apology. He says, I regret that you made it impossible for me to talk with you. For what reason? I think you made your ideas very clear during the middle of his talk. So let's talk about another physicist, which if you saw by the title, it's going to be C.N. Yang, also known as Frank Yang. That was his American name. And it comes at a weird time right now because there's a lot of hate crimes going on against Asian Americans. And, you know, that type of stuff is important, like, especially in our community. Like, we should be above that as physicists, above hate against other cultures, against other races. And I think this is a really cool thing to just take a second and think about someone who was a Chinese-American physicist who had just one of the most monumental impacts on physics that, you know, possibly ever, that you might not know too much about. I mean, pretty much everybody has heard of YangMills theory, right? Like, that's the theory. We'll talk more about what it is, a little bit more about what it is. I'm not going to get into the depth of it, as far as like the math equations go and things like that, but we'll talk about what it is, why it's important. But yeah, so C.N. Yang was a Chinese-born American physicist. He developed the most famous YangMills theory, the one that, you know, describes fundamental forces of pretty much all of particle physics. And so he was born October 1st, 1922. He's still alive. So October 1st, 1922, still alive at the age of 98. He came to the States by boat in 1946. He had won a scholarship. Related to Andrew? No, he was not. I mean, different Yang Gang. But he came to the States by boat in 1946. But he said it was incredibly difficult to come to the States because there was no transports. There was no way for him to get from... he was actually in Calcutta, India. He went to Calcutta, India to wait for a troop transport to take him from... an American troop transport to take him from Calcutta to the States. Apparently there was a crazy, crazy storm, and Yang was convinced that he would die. So yeah, so he came by a troop transport. He got caught in a storm. And yeah, he was convinced that he would die, but he did not. He made it to the States. He attended a graduate school at Chicago. He worked with some pretty famous people from Chicago. One of those people became a very close friend of his, Enrico Fermi, and they did some work together. And that work outlined what was necessary to get to the pion. So Yang he had a very, very good education in China. He was affected by the Japanese War. I think that was kind of something that he talks about as like one of the reasons why he felt like he had to get out of China. It was a very dangerous time during the early 40s, the early 1940s, when Japan, after an 8-year war with China, had invaded China very close to, if not also moved into the area where Yang grew up. So he moved from that area where the Japanese had invaded to closer to like Beijing, and then eventually moved out. But he talks very negatively. Obviously, it impacted him tremendously, as well as many of the Chinese nationals at the time. That war that Japan waged on China, because he said they were absolutely incredibly cruel to the Chinese people, and it was very, very difficult for him. Which was weird because, like, someone asked him about how he felt about the bombing, the United States bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and he said that he was relieved that it ended the war. And I'm sure, like many people, he had very conflicting, emotions about it. But he just kept recalling how horrible they were to his friends and family and stuff like that, and how, like, absolutely dreadful that occupation was. It was really weird and kind of like, I don't know, like it was a really eye-opening interview. Yeah, that's definitely a fair point, Rambo. It was from the Chinese side, and like I think C.N. Yang had the perspective of, being a mathematician's son who, wanted peace and did not want war. And, they had a different situation from, say, the Chinese military or something like that. It is hard to believe that in an 8-year war, only one side was cruel. It is hard to believe that. But this was from his personal experience during that war, which I just thought was an interesting way of looking at it. But yeah, like I said, so during his time at Chicago, he became close friends with Fermi. They published a bunch of papers that ended up outlining the work for the pion. And then in 1949, if you guys remember from our very first Old Man Reads Old Books from 1949, we talked about Dyson's work on renormalization, right? How he was kind of laid out the first renormalization scheme, uniting, not reuniting, but uniting Feynman and Schwinger's work, which is what we know now as QED, and how Dyson kind of outlined how that would work, right? It had been known that Oppenheimer was very intrigued by Dyson. Dyson was a military man in the British Air Force, came to Cornell. I don't think he finished his PhD. I'm pretty sure he never had a PhD. But yeah, he was able to take this idea that Feynman and Schwinger, these two ideas that Feynman and Schwinger had, the canonical versus the path integral, and he was able to combine them into what is now known as QED, where the renormalization that he did actually worked for some level. Let's see here. So then Oppenheimer gave this talk at Chicago where Yang was, and Yang really enjoyed the talk. He thought that type of idea, the quantum field theory that was in 1949, that the quantum electrodynamics really kind of getting its footsteps. And it's a weird thing now, because now we're talking about it like it might be wrong. Like there might be some sort of mistake in it. Or that there's more to it that we don't understand, right? So it's exciting now, and in 1949 it was exciting to Yang as well. He was, like we were at that age, just very excited and anticipating these new things that were coming up. And he applied for a postdoc position at the institute where Oppenheimer was the director of, the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. And of course Oppenheimer said yes, because Yang was doing phenomenal work. He spent 17 years at the institute where he says he did his best work. What was that work, you might ask? So YangMills theory was the best work. That was the thing that was huge, right? It was developed in 1954, and it really takes the fundamental physics of figuring out how things are put together, right? That's kind of what fundamental physics is. It's figuring out how things work, how things are put together. And YangMills gauge theory actually gives a mathematical structure to these fundamental pieces of reality. And as we're going to see, there was one extra thing that they kept getting when they tried to solve these equations that ended up being YangMills theory. And our reading for today is going to explain what that thing was that was missing. But yeah, so if you don't know, the YangMills is a millennium problem. It's one of the 7 millennium problems. It's still unsolved. Let me read you, actually I'll bring you with me, directly from the Clay Math website. The YangMills mass gap, the laws of quantum physics stand to the world of elementary particles in the way that Newton's laws of classical mechanics stand to the macroscopic world. But yeah, so the successful use of YangMills theory to describe the strong interactions of elementary particles depends on a subtle quantum mechanical property called the mass gap. The quantum particles have positive masses, even though the classical waves travel at the speed of light. This property has been discovered by physicists from experiment and confirmed by computer simulations, but it still has not been understood from a theoretical point of view. Progress to establishing the existence of the YangMills theory and the mass gap will require the introduction of fundamental new ideas, both in physics and in mathematics. This is a millennium problem. You solve this, you get $1 million. Okay? This is a very, very difficult problem. It's very exciting, and maybe something, there might be something related to the, I don't know, maybe Justin will be like, no, but I just think this could be, slightly related to the magnetic moment anomaly, right? Like these, maybe not directly, but there's, again, at least analogously, there's a problem here that we need to solve that does not, where our theory does not match experiment, right? So that's really exciting. Okay, so in 1962, this is where we go to. In 1962, President Kennedy awarded the Fermi Award to Oppenheimer. Now, Oppenheimer had a rough past. That's going to be a story we'll talk about at a different time. But Oppenheimer was accused of all sorts of government conspiracy things. And yeah, it was really ugly for Oppenheimer for a long time while he was the director of the Institute and after. Or at least while he was the director of the Institute, maybe before, I should have said. But the thing was, so President Kennedy, before he was assassinated, wanted to award Oppenheimer that award as kind of like to make amends. And at 1965, after the murder of Kennedy, I guess there was some back and forth about whether or not they should actually award it to Oppenheimer because Kennedy had been assassinated and Oppenheimer was still, people still didn't trust him. But they did give it to him. And because he got the award, it was kind of like a good thing for, a good time for Oppenheimer to retire from the director of the Institute for Advanced Studies. So he asked Yang, again, Chinese-American physicist, working on, you know, the Yang-Mills theory, the theory that describes the, you know, how all of the forces work together at the particle level. And Yang actually declined the offer and instead, shortly after, moved to Stony Brook University, where now there exists the Cian Yang Center for Theoretical Physicists at Stony Brook, one of the most renowned, you know, research facilities at least in the States, if not the world. And it's named after him. And he moved there when it was just a very small school in 1965. But like with his help, he built it up and made it into like I said, one of the best research facilities in the United States, if not the world. So very, very cool, very good work by him in that regard as well. But let's talk a little bit about this story, okay? The story is the conflict between Wolfgang Pauli and Cian Yang. This you might not have heard of, which I have not heard of before this. The story refers to the year 1953. Pauli could have been the author of the seminal discovery of Yang-Mills theories, which we know now constitute the basis of our current understanding of nature at short distances. Pauli was interested in a six-dimensional theory of Einstein's field equations of general relativity. If you guys remember now, this was kind of like a popular thing, like the Kaluza-Klein error of trying to up the amount of dimensions so that you could understand more physics. Like, for instance, they were able to unite electromagnetism with gravity with using a five-dimensional system. I think that's correct. If someone can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure that was a correct thing. Or maybe it was just 4 dimensions of space and none of time, something along those lines. But it was popular to do this of the time. So Pauli was interested in the six-dimensional theory of Einstein's field equations. So he compactified 2 extra dimensions. Sound familiar? Compactified dimensions. And into a 2-dimensional sphere where inevitably leads to Yang-Mills. So Pauli got the same answer earlier than Frank Yang and Robert Mills did. But non-abelian gauge bosons remained massless, and at that time the only massless field known to physicists were photons and gravitons, which are still not known to physicists nowadays, so it's a little bit strange. But either way, but yeah, so they were at the time they hypothesized gravitons and knew about photons, right? That was Einstein's work. Plus the neutrino postulated by Pauli in 1931, that was also considered massless at the time. Turns out it's not massless. Very small mass, a tiny mass. Pauli said, "I have already introduced one hypothetical massless particle. I have no nerve to introduce more." So that's what stopped him from publishing his research, right? Pauli said he felt really uneasy about these. I think so too. I think so too, Rambo. I just can't remember I just can't remember their name. But he worked with Einstein a lot. Bose, right? Yeah. Cool. So Pauli said, so that's what he said. So because of the super high requirements for his own work in physics, he put on hold his publication of the Yang-Mills. In the meantime, the theory was independently developed by C.N. Frank, Yang, and Robert Mills, as reported by the Princeton Seminar and published in Physical Review. Remember, he was at Princeton at this time. Pauli was continuously pestered by C.N. Yang, asking him about the mass of the non-abelian gauge bosons, now known as, does anyone know what they are known as now? But, Pauli, knowing that they were massless and therefore a killer of the theory, as it was believed before the invention of the Higgs mechanism and quantum chromodynamics. So, Q and R bosons, come on. Come on. These are gluons. Gluons were the non-abelian gauge bosons. Justin knew the answer, by the way. They were the non-abelian gauge bosons that were the reason that everything was held together, right? So Yang just sat down at the... Okay, so Yang... wait, did I miss it? Oh, yeah, so Pauli was continuously pestering Yang about the mass of the non-abelian gauge bosons during a lecture that Yang was giving. And Yang responded that he wasn't sure about the answer. Apparently, Pauli was so insistent and hostile with his questions that Yang just sat down in the front row and stopped talking. That's crazy. Like, okay, so have you ever been to these, talks where someone's presenting, a very controversial idea? Because I have. I was at a talk where Eric Verlinde was discussing his entropic gravity. And it was a workshop dedicated to talking about simulations of dark matter. Let me just tell you that Eric Verlinde literally had to say that he will not be taking any more questions. You need to stop asking questions. We will take questions at the end of the talk. Because people kept conjecturing. There was multiple people who were standing up and literally just yelling really loud voices about their objections to, really stuff? Oh, that's awesome. I like Eric Verlinde. I actually thought his ideas were really cool and deserved the time that they were allotted at the conference. But people were so rude and disrespectful, just standing up and just shouting over him. It was rough. It was rough to watch. But yeah, so Pauli was doing this to C.N. Yang, continuously pestering about this mass. And, that they should not exist, that they killed the theory completely. But Yang just stopped down. He just stopped talking and sat down. And then Oppenheimer, friend of Yang, encouraged, the one who led him there 15 years ago, led him to the Institute for Advanced Study. He encouraged him to keep giving his talk, so he did. But listen to the audacity of Pauli during this too, just crazy. So the story of the would-be discovered YangMills by Pauli is described in The Dawning of Gauge Theory. That's a book by Abraham Pais. And documented. Excuse me. So it was a book by The Dawning of Gauge was by Orifites Orifierte. That's a rough name. And then also documented by Abraham Pais in The Genius of Science, a Portrait Gallery. So those are the references that this author uses. Let's see. So in late 1953, Pauli's enthusiasm, so this is about Pauli's theory, right? His enthusiasm began to wane about his ideas. He said if one tries to formulate field equations, one will always obtain a vector meson with rest mass 0. One could try to get other meson fields, pseudoscalars, and positive rest mass, but I feel like that's too artificial. And it was, because you didn't need it. You had gluons, and that's okay. There it is, Slayer. Thank you. So then, Yang had not been present while Pauli gave his seminar in memoir of Yang. In his memoir, Yang recollects, Oppenheimer invited me to return to Princeton for a few days in late February. And this was, I think, after he left. No. It was just different than that. So Oppenheimer invited me to return to Princeton for a few days in late February to give a seminar on our work. Soon after my seminar began, Pauli asked, what is the mass of this field? I said, we don't know. Then I resumed my presentation, but soon Pauli again asked the same question again. I said something to the effect that that was a very complicated problem. We had worked on it and had come to no definite conclusion. I still remember his repartee. That is not a sufficient excuse, Pauli said. I was so taken aback that I decided after a few moments of hesitation to sit down. There was general embarrassment. I feel embarrassed for Pauli. That's what I feel embarrassed about. Finally, Oppenheimer said we should let Frank proceed. I then resumed, and Pauli did not ask any more questions during the seminar. Then Yang continued that he didn't remember what happened at the end of the seminar, but the next day he found the following message from Oppenheimer. February 24th, 1954. Dear Yang, I regret that you made it almost impossible for me to talk to you after the seminar. All good wishes, sincerely yours, Pauli. What kind of apology is that? That's not an apology. He says, I regret that you made it impossible for me to talk with you. For what reason? I think you made your ideas very clear during the middle of his talk. Abraham Peiss comments as well in his documentation of it, I too was at Yang's seminar and well recall Pauli's critical and negative reaction. He was not the only one to respond that way. Indeed, the YangMills theory was initially received with skepticism, to put it mildly. The reason was that the quanta of the new fields appeared to have zero mass, as Pauli had already noted in his December 1953 letter to me. In their first paper that on that subject, a piece of chutzpah, for that time, Yang and Mills simply stated that they had no satisfactory answer for that difficulty, which should warrant some skepticism, right? And skepticism is one thing. About Eric Verlinde's piece on entropic gravity. Skepticism is fine. I think the skepticism is very healthy for an idea like that. But the audacity to stand up and say that's no excuse. And of course you know that Pauli is bitter. He's bitter, he's egocentric, just like most physicists are, especially physicists of that time. Were very egocentric because he had that idea. He thought that that was a real thing. But he was so upset and did not want to he was so upset and did not want to be the one who put the right answer on the back burner that he had to make sure that everyone knew that Yang was wrong, which is wild to me. Wild to me. But it's pretty cool nonetheless that Yang was right, that Oppenheimer was nice enough to keep encouraging him to go forward. Oppenheimer, say what you will, we're going to have to do a deep dive on Oppenheimer at some point, but he definitely did a lot of good things for the Institute for Advanced Study. But I don't know enough about him, whether or not he did net positive or what. Pauli's a low-key jerk. Yeah, that was not even that low-key. Yang 1, Pauli 0. Love it. I love it. That's really funny.